In a case that seemed impossible, a beloved community figure denies everything in court. But behind his friendly smile was a monster hiding in plain sight. As investigators unraveled his perfect life, they discovered a chilling secret and a hidden graveyard that explained why his own brother looked on in terror, even while smiling at the judge. But the entire trial, full of confident denials and a polished facade, would ultimately hinge on the moment his own brother testifies, revealing a truth more horrifying than anyone could imagine. Some evil doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning, but arrives with a helpful smile and a steady, reassuring hand. It wears the mask of a neighbor, the guise of a friend, the costume of a good man willing to help a stranger in need. This particular evil had a name, Ethan Carlson, and his darkness would soon extinguish one of the brightest lights in Savannah, Georgia. The old southern city, a place dripping with charm, history, and generations of hidden scandals, was about to add another, far more gruesome story to its shadowed ledger. On a humid Tuesday evening in late October, the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oaks seemed to weep with the oppressive weight of the coming night. 24-year-old Ella Powell, a pediatric nurse known for her boundless compassion, was driving home after a grueling 12-hour shift. Her car, a reliable but aging sedan, sputtered to a stop on a quiet tree-lined street, its engine finally succumbing to a long-ignored ailment. It was in this moment of vulnerability, stranded under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, that a truck pulled up behind her and a man stepped out, his face etched with practiced concern. Ethan Carlson was, by all accounts, a pillar of his Savannah community, a man whose easy charm and quick offers of help were legendary in his historic neighborhood. He was the one who organized the annual block party, who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, and who always had a friendly wave for children passing by. His offer to help Ella was textbook Ethan, a seamless performance of civic duty that hid a cavernous emptiness devoid of any human empathy. He spoke in calming tones, assuring her it was no trouble at all, a simple kindness for a neighbor in distress. He tinkered under the hood for a few minutes, a pantomime of assistance designed to lull her into a state of absolute trust. He told her the fix was beyond his roadside capabilities, but offered to give her a ride home, a gesture of generosity that felt like a blessing. Ella, exhausted and grateful, saw no reason to refuse the kindness of this stranger, who seemed so genuinely decent and safe. She got into his truck, thanking him profusely, completely unaware that she had just accepted a ride from a predator who viewed her kindness not as a virtue, but as a fatal vulnerability. The doors locked, the smile vanished, and the true nature of Ethan Carlson was revealed in the terrifying silence that followed. The search for Ella Powell began the next morning when she failed to show up for her shift at the hospital, an act so contrary to her character that it immediately triggered alarms. Her parents, frantic with worry, contacted the Savannah Police Department, their voices trembling with a premonition of unimaginable dread. The initial investigation moved slowly, tracing her final movements from the hospital to the quiet Oakline Street where her abandoned car was found. Her purse and phone were still inside. Signs that this was no simple robbery, but something far more sinister and personal. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, the historic homes with their sprawling porches and perfectly manicured gardens standing as silent witnesses. They spoke to residents who remembered seeing the stalled car but could offer little more. The evening's events blurring into the mundane routine of their lives. The city of Savannah, which prided itself on its gentile civility, held its breath. The disappearance of a young woman, a stark reminder that even the most charming facades can hide ugly secrets. Ella's family and friends distributed flyers, their faces a collage of hope and despair, pleading for any information that could bring their beloved daughter home. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, that provided the first real break in the case, a faint tire track in the soft shoulder of the road near Ella's car. It didn't match any of the vehicles owned by local residents, its tread pattern suggesting a heavy-duty truck. Forensics teams carefully made a cast of the impression, a fragile piece of evidence that carried the weight of a family's hope. Lead detective Mark Holmes, a veteran investigator who had seen the darkest corners of Savannah's hidden world, knew that the owner of that truck likely held the key to Ella Powell's fate. The investigation became a painstaking search for a ghost, a specific truck among thousands in the sprawling city and surrounding counties. Days turned into a week, and the optimistic energy of the initial search began to W&E, replaced by a grim resignation. The local news covered the story nightly. Ella's smiling face a constant, heartbreaking presence on television screens across the city. The community held vigils, praying for a miracle, unaware that the man responsible for their collective grief was living among them, participating in the charade of a concerned citizen. Ethan Carlson even gave an interview to a local news crew, expressing his shock and sadness. His performance of empathy utterly flawless and chillingly believable. The man who had lured a good Samaritan to her death was now playing the part of the concerned neighbor, a wolf hiding in plain sight. The city's undercurrent of hidden scandals felt more pronounced than ever, as if the very air was thick with unspoken truths. Detective Holmes felt it in his bones, the sense that this case was more than a simple abduction, that it was tied to something deeper and more rotten. He re-interviewed everyone who lived on the street where Ella's car was found, pressing for any detail, no matter how insignificant. It was an elderly woman, her memory sharpened by Holmes's patient questioning, who finally recalled the truck. She remembered its color and the custom decal on the back window, a small but crucial piece of the puzzle that would eventually lead them to the monster's door. The description of the truck was entered into a statewide database, and after days of dead ends, a match was found. The vehicle was registered to one Ethan Carlson, a local contractor with a sterling reputation and no criminal record. When Detective Holmes and his partner arrived at Carlson's home, a beautifully restored historic house in a wealthy part of Savannah, they were greeted by the man himself. He was calm, friendly, and cooperative, the very picture of a man with nothing to hide. He invited them inside, offered them a drink, and answered their questions with an unnerving placidity, his mask of normally perfectly intact. Ethan admitted to seeing the stalled car that night and even stopping to help, a story he had rehearsed to perfection. He claimed he had offered the young woman a ride, but she had politely declined, saying she had already called a friend. He expressed his sincere hope that she would be found safe, his performance of concern so convincing that it momentarily gave the seasoned detectives pause. But as they looked around his immaculate home, a sense of deep unease began to settle in, a feeling that something was profoundly wrong beneath the polished surface of this perfect life. The contrast between the man's charming exterior and the horrific crime they were investigating was jarring. This was the challenge of evil in a place like Savannah, where politeness and appearances were paramount. The city's history was filled with tales of powerful families and their hidden scandals of dark deeds committed behind the closed doors of magnificent homes. Detective Holmes knew that the most dangerous monsters were not the ones who looked the part, but the ones who looked just like everyone else. And as Ethan Carlson smiled, his eyes empty of anything resembling a soul, Holmes knew he was standing in the presence of a predator of the highest order. The initial interview with Ethan Carlson yielded nothing but a polished and plausible story. Yet, Detective Mark Holmes couldn't shake the feeling of profound unease. He secured a warrant to search Carlson's truck and property, a step based on the tenuous link of the tire tracks and the elderly witness's recollection. It was during this search that the first crack in Carlson's facade appeared, a small dark red stain on the passenger side floor mat of his truck. To the naked eye, it was almost invisible, but to the forensic team, it was a beacon, a silent testament to a violent struggle that would be impossible to explain away. The arrest of Ethan Carlson sent a shock wave through the historic streets of Savannah. Friends and neighbors reacted with disbelief and outrage, defending the man they knew as a kind and generous community leader. They flooded the police department with calls attesting to his good character and insisting that a terrible mistake had been made. This public defense was the very foundation of Carlson's predatory strategy. He had built a fortress of goodwill around himself, a shield of public opinion that he believed was impenetrable. When Detective Holmes and his team arrived to take him into custody, Ethan displayed no emotion, no surprise, no fear. He simply nodded as if expecting them and calmly asked for a moment to get his jacket. There was no resistance, no panicked denial, just a chilling and unnatural calm that was more incriminating than any outburst would have been. As he was led from his house in handcuffs past the gawking neighbors and flashing news cameras, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk played on his lips. It was the look of a man who was not a participant in the drama, but its sole director. In the sterile, windowless interrogation room, Ethan Carlson's composure remained unbroken. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting calmly on the metal table, his posture relaxed and confident. He refused to speak, responding to Detective Holmes's questions with nothing more than a steady, unnerving gaze. The only sound from his side of the table was the soft, rhythmic tap of his finger, a display of bored impatience that grated on the nerves of the seasoned investigators. He was a man in complete control, or so he believed. The hours ticked by, and the interrogation became a battle of wills. A silent war waged across a small metal table. Detective Holmes laid out the mounting evidence, the tire tracks, the witness identification of his truck, the suspicious stain found on his floor mat. With each new piece of information, Ethan's only response was to let his smirk widen, a gesture of pure, unadulterated contempt. It was a look that said he knew something they didn't, that he was enjoying their futile attempts to pierce his armor. His silence was not the silence of fear, but the silence of arrogance. This chilling lack of reaction was a psychological tactic designed to frustrate and intimidate. He was treating the most serious moment of his life as a game, a performance for an audience of two detectives. He was raying in the attention, soaking in the power he felt he held over them. In his mind, he was the smartest person in the room, a master manipulator who could outwit a system he viewed with disdain. He was not a suspect under pressure. He was a predator observing his captors, amused by their clumsy efforts to understand his world. The detectives changed tactics, shifting from evidence to emotion, bringing up Ella Powell's name, describing the anguish of her family. They showed him her photograph, her face bright with the promise of a future that had been stolen. Ethan glanced at the photo for a fraction of a second, his expression unchanged, a flicker of cold amusement in his eyes. The only acknowledgement, the name, the face, the family's pain. None of it registered as real to him. They were merely props in his personal drama, insignificant pieces on a board where he was the only player that mattered. This was the true face of the man who had hidden behind a mask of neighborly charm for so long. The polite contractor, the helpful friend, the concerned citizen. It was all an elaborate costume. The real Ethan Carlson was this man in the interrogation room. A silent, smirking void, a black hole of narcissism who felt nothing for the lives he destroyed. His enjoyment of the process was palpable, a sickening energy that filled the small room and left the detectives feeling a deep professional chill. He was not just guilty, he was evil, and he wanted them to know it. As the interrogation stretched into its 10th hour, the forensic lab returned the preliminary results on the stain from the truck. It was human blood, and while a full DNA profile would take longer, its presence was damning. When Detective Holmes presented this information, a visible shift occurred in Ethan's demeanor. The smirk didn't disappear, but it became sharper, more malicious. He leaned forward for the first time, breaking his silent vigil, and whispered a single chilling question. "Is that all you have?" It was a taunt, a challenge thrown down by a man who believed he had committed the perfect crime. He was daring them to find more, confident that they never would. His belief in his own intellectual superiority was absolute, a core component of his psychopathy. He wasn't denying the crime. He was raying in it, enjoying the cat-and-mouse game he was playing with law enforcement. He saw himself as an apex predator and them as lesser creatures incapable of comprehending his genius. The decision was made to charge him with abduction and murder, even with the confession they had hoped for remaining unspoken. As he was formally processed, fingerprinted, and photographed, his smirk never wavered. He stared directly into the camera for his mugshot, his eyes alight with a triumphant gleam. He was no longer Ethan Carlson, the helpful neighbor from Savannah. He was becoming a local celebrity, a monster whose name would be whispered with fear and fascination. And in his twisted, narcissistic mind, this infamy was a victory. The silence in the interrogation room had been more revealing than any confession. It was a performance of pure, unadulterated evil, a demonstration of a soul so empty that it could only be filled with the attention and fear of others. He didn't need to admit what he did because his every action, his every smirk, his every gesture screamed his guilt to the heavens. He was a man who believed he was untouchable, a god in his own small, dark universe. But his universe was about to collide with the relentless machinery of justice, and a secret buried beneath his. Pristine Garden was waiting to be unearthed. The charming city of Savannah was about to discover the true depth of the scandal hidden in its midst. a truth far more horrifying than a single tragic murder. While Ethan Carlson sat in his jail cell, radiating an aura of smug invincibility, Detective Mark Holmes and his team executed a second, more thorough search of his property. The beautifully restored historic home, once a symbol of Carlson's standing in the community, was now a potential tomb. Its manicured gardens and charming facade hiding a monstrous secret. The initial search had been focused on the house and truck, but Holmes, haunted by Carlson's arrogant demeanor, felt a deep instinctual certainty that there was more to be found, something that would explain the profound emptiness in the suspect's eyes. The search began in the backyard, a space that was as meticulously maintained as the rest of the property. A pristine lawn, vibrant flower beds, and a handcrafted stone patio spoke of a man who took pride in his home. But as the team began to probe the grounds, they noticed an area near the back fence, partially concealed by a row of dense hedges where the earth seemed to have been recently disturbed. It was a subtle inconsistency, but in a yard this perfect, it stood out like a scar. The atmosphere, thick with Savannah's humid air, grew heavy with anticipation as the forensic team began to excavate the patch of disturbed soil. The shovels cut into the rich, dark earth, each scoop revealing nothing but more dirt. For a moment, it seemed as though Holmes's hunch might be wrong. Then, one of the shovels struck something solid with a dull, sickening thud. The digging became more delicate, the team switching to hand treels and brushes, carefully removing the soil layer by layer. What they uncovered first was a piece of rotting fabric, then chillingly, a human bone. A collective gasp went through the assembled officers as the reality of their discovery began to sink in. This was not the final resting place of Ella Powell. The remains were too decomposed. This was something older, a secret that had been buried in this quiet, respectable yard for years. The excavation continued with a grim, methodical urgency, the charming southern garden transforming into a place of profound horror. Beneath the first set of remains, they found another and then another. The patch of disturbed earth was not a single grave. It was a pit, a mass burial site hidden in plain sight. The scandal that had been lurking beneath the surface of Savannah's Gentile society had finally been unearthed, and it was more grotesque than anyone could have imagined. Ethan Carlson was not just a murderer. He was a prolific serial killer, a predator who had used his friendly, helpful persona to lure victim after victim to their deaths, burying them just yards from where he hosted neighborhood barbecues. The discovery of the mass grave in Ethan Carlson's backyard became a national news story, turning the historic city of Savannah into the epicenter of a media frenzy. The charming streets were now clogged with satellite trucks and reporters, all clamoring for details about the monster who had lived undetected among them. The friends and neighbors who had so vehemently defended Carlson were now forced into a horrified silence, their belief in his good character shattered by the undeniable truth being unearthed from his garden. The mask had not just slipped, it had been violently ripped away, revealing the rotted soul beneath. The painstaking process of identifying the victims began a heartbreaking task that involved cross-referencing the remains with missing persons reports from across the state and beyond. Each identification brought fresh waves of grief connecting the cold, sterile evidence to real people, real families who had spent years searching for answers. They were the forgotten, the vulnerable, the people who had the misfortune of crossing paths with a predator who saw them as nothing more than objects for his own gratification. The number of bodies eventually reached 7, a staggering tally of death that spoke to a reign of terror that had gone unnoticed for over a decade. For the prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Victoria Gray, the discovery of the grave transformed the case entirely. They were no longer prosecuting a single murder based on circumstantial evidence and a blood stain. They were now building a case against one of the most prolific serial killers in the state's history. The challenge was immense to connect Carlson not just to Ella Powell, but to every single victim buried in his yard, to give each of them their day in court and ensure that the man responsible would never again see the outside of a prison cell. In his jail cell, Ethan Carlson learned of the discovery with the same unnerving calm he had displayed since his arrest. He watched the news reports detailing the excavation of his yard with a detached tourist, as if observing a story about someone else. There was no remorse, no panic, only a quiet satisfaction. The discovery of his secret graveyard was not a defeat in his eyes. It was the ultimate validation of his genius. He had managed to hide his monstrous activities for so long, right under the noses of a community that adored him. This reaction provided a crucial insight into his psychology for the prosecution's team. He was a classic narcissist with a god complex, a man who craved infamy as much as he craved control. The public horror and media attention were not a source of shame for him. They were his trophies, the grand stage he had always believed he deserved. He had finally been recognized for what he was, and in his twisted mind, that was a form of victory. He began to see the upcoming trial not as a legal battle, but as his debut, a platform from which he could display his intellectual superiority to the world. The evidence against him was now mountainous. Forensic analysis of the remains would provide timelines, causes of death, and potentially trace evidence linking back to Carlson. His double life was now exposed in the most horrific way imaginable. The friendly contractor who helped his neighbors was also the sadistic monster who buried his victims in the garden. The two identities, once so carefully separated, had now merged into a single terrifying portrait of human evil. The city of Savannah, so proud of its history and charm, was now forced to confront the fact that it had been home to a monster, a man whose evil was as deep and as old as the city's own hidden scandals. The grave in the backyard was more than just a crime scene. It was a monument to years of deception and a chilling testament to the darkness that can flourish behind a friendly smile. In the months leading up to the trial, Ethan Carlson's behavior in pre-trial hearings offered a terrifying preview of the spectacle to come. He seemed to relish the procedural nature of the courtroom, treating each appearance as a performance. His defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Stephen Wright, found himself in an impossible position. His client refused to cooperate, dismissed all legal advice with a wave of his hand, and seemed determined to sabotage his own defense at every turn. Wright was tasked with defending a man who not only showed no remorse, but seemed to mock the very concept of it. The charade began during a hearing to determine the admissibility of the evidence found on his property. As the prosecution detailed the grim discoveries from his backyard, Ethan sat at the defense table, a look of placid boredom on his face. When the judge asked if he understood the proceedings, he simply nodded, a faint smile on his lips. But it was during the testimony of a forensic expert that his performance of remorselessness escalated. He began to feign tears, his shoulders shaking with what appeared to be sobs of overwhelming guilt. It was a sickening performance, a calculated pantomime of sorrow, so unconvincing that it was deeply insulting to the memories of his victims and the intelligence of everyone in the courtroom. He would dab at his dry eyes with a tissue, his face contorted in a mask of grief, only to be seen moments later whispering a joke to his exasperated attorney. The shift from supposed anguish to casual amusement was instantaneous and horrifying, a clear demonstration that he saw the entire legal process as a stage for his own dark amusement. He was not faking remorse to gain sympathy. He was faking it to mock the very idea that he was capable of such an emotion. The families of the victims who attended every hearing were forced to watch this grotesque display. Their raw, unbearable grief was met with the cheap theatrics of the man responsible for their pain. They watched as he pretended to cry, his performance a vile parody of the real tears they shed every single day. It was an act of profound psychological cruelty, a way for him to continue to exert power and control over them. Even from behind the confines of the defense table, he was feeding on their pain, his narcissism nourished by their suffering. This behavior extended beyond the courtroom walls. From jail, he began to write letters not of apology, but of self-pity and blame. He wrote to local newspapers and television stations, casting himself as the true victim, a man misunderstood by a cruel and unjust system. He claimed he was being framed, that the evidence had been planted, and that he was a scapegoat for a corrupt police force. These letters, filled with grammatical errors and grandiose delusions, were a further attempt to control the narrative to paint himself as a martyr rather than the monster he was. His public performance of remorse was a strategic, if deeply flawed, part of this campaign. He believed that by mimicking the emotions a normal person would feel, he could manipulate public opinion and create doubt. But his inability to genuinely comprehend emotions like guilt or sadness made his performance a caricature. His timing was always slightly off, his expressions a little too exaggerated. He was an alien trying to imitate human behavior, and the result was not sympathy, but a deep, unsettling revulsion. During one particularly tense pretrial hearing, the prosecution presented a piece of evidence found in his home, a small silver locket belonging to Ella Powell. As the prosecutor described how it had been a gift from her grandmother, Ethan broke down into his most dramatic display of sobbing. But this time his act was so over the top, so transparently false, that a wave of audible disgust rippled through the courtroom gallery. Even the judge, a seasoned veteran named Eleanor Ross, watched him with an expression of undisguised contempt. The mask of remorse was not a mask at all. It was a mirror reflecting his own twisted perception of the world. He saw emotion as a tool, a weakness in others to be exploited for his own gain. He could not feel remorse, so he wore it like a costume, putting it on and taking it off as it suited his purpose. His attempts to fake it were not a sign of a guilty conscience, but a testament to a complete lack of one. It was the ultimate expression of his psychopathy, a final insulting dance on the graves of the people he had murdered. His performance was not meant to convince anyone of his sorrow, but to show everyone that he was above it, that the rules of human decency did not apply to him. The old southern city of Savannah, a place that valued decorum and sincerity, was about to witness a trial where the defendant's primary strategy was to insult the very foundations of those values with a sickening, unconvincing, and utterly transparent performance of a soul he did not possess. The first day of the trial of Ethan Carlson was a media spectacle unlike anything Savannah had ever seen. The historic courthouse, usually a place of quiet dignity, was besieged by reporters, photographers, and a public both horrified and fascinated by the case. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was thick with a mixture of grief, anger, and morbid curiosity. The families of the 7 known victims sat in the front row, a silent, unified wall of sorrow, their eyes fixed on the man who had torn their lives apart. When Ethan was led into the courtroom, he looked directly at them, a polite, almost pleasant smile on his face, as if greeting old friends. The trial began with the opening statement from Assistant District Attorney Victoria Gray. She stood before the jury, her voice steady and somber, and painted a picture of a man who had perfected the art of deception. She described him as a predator hiding in plain sight, a man who used his community's trust as a hunting ground. Her words were powerful and precise, laying out the road map of the case she intended to build, a case that would be built on a mountain of forensic evidence and the testimony of those who knew him best. The first witness called to the stand was Ella Powell's mother, a woman whose face was etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have aged her a decade in a matter of months. She spoke of her daughter's kindness, her passion for nursing, her infectious laugh. Her testimony was a heartbreaking portrait of a life stolen, a future erased. She recounted the last conversation she had with her daughter, a simple, loving exchange that now felt like a sacred memory. The courtroom was silent. Every person in the room captivated by the raw, unfiltered pain of a mother's loss. As Mrs. Powell spoke, her voice trembling but unbroken, she described the day she bought Ella the silver locket that had been found in Ethan's home. She talked about how Ella had never taken it off, how it was a symbol of their family's love. It was at this moment, the emotional peak of her testimony, that a sound shattered the semity of the room. From the defense table came a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt, a sound of amusement in the face of unbearable suffering. Every head in the courtroom snapped towards Ethan Carlson. He was leaning back in his chair, a wide, chilling grin on his face, his eyes sparkling with mirth. His own lawyer, Stephen Wright, looked at him with a mixture of horror and fury, whispering frantically for him to stop. But Ethan ignored him, his gaze locked on Mrs. Powell, enjoying the shock and pain his laughter had caused. It was a moment of pure unmasked evil, a deliberate act of psychological torture performed for a captive audience. The outburst was so shocking, so contrary to any semblance of human decency, that Judge Ross had to slam her gavel down to restore order. She admonished Ethan in the sternest possible terms, her voice shaking with rage, warning him that another such display would have him removed from his own trial. Ethan simply nodded, his grin fading back to his trademark polite smile, as if nothing had happened. The mask was back in place, but everyone in the room had seen the monster behind it. This infuriating outburst defined the tone for the rest of the trial. It was a clear signal that Ethan Carlson was not going to play the part of a penitent defendant. He was going to be an active participant in the proceedings, a saboteur of decorum, a tormentor of the grieving. His laughter was a declaration of war on the very process of justice, a statement that he did not fear the consequences because he did not respect the system or the people it was designed to protect. The incident was a turning point for the jury. Any shred of doubt, any possibility that this charming, well-liked man could be the victim of a terrible mistake was obliterated by that single horrifying laugh. They had seen with their own eyes and ears the blackness in his soul. They had witnessed a man who could listen to a mother's tribute to her murdered daughter and find it amusing. From that moment on, the trial was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about the methodical process of holding a monster accountable for his crimes. For the families, the outburst was another wound, another layer of cruelty heaped upon their already unbearable pain. But it was also a strange sort of validation. It confirmed that the man who had murdered their loved ones was not human in any way that mattered. He was a creature of pure malice, and his open display of it in court, while agonizing to watch, steeled their resolve to see him punished to the fullest extent of the law. The charming city of Savannah, with its Gentile traditions, had never seen such a brazen display of contempt in its halls of justice. The trial had begun, and the defendant had already shown his true face, the laughing, remorseless face of evil. In the days that followed Ethan Carlson's chilling outburst, Assistant District Attorney Victoria Gray began to construct her case brick by painstaking brick. She presented a mountain of forensic evidence connecting him to the 7 victims found in his yard. There were fibers, hair samples, and soil analysis that linked each victim to his property and his truck. The prosecution's narrative was clear and methodical, painting a picture of a serial predator who had operated with terrifying precision for more than a decade. But Gray knew that to truly convey the depth of Carlson's depravity, the jury needed to understand the personal nature of his cruelty. The most powerful moments of the trial came not from the scientific experts, but from the evidence that spoke to the lives that had been lost. Gray introduced personal items found in a hidden lockbox in Carlson's basement, a secret collection of mementos he had taken from his victims. Each item was presented to the court with a solemn reverence that stood in stark contrast to the defendant's casual demeanor. There was a class ring, a worn leather wallet, a single earring, and a child's faded photograph. These were not just pieces of evidence. They were stolen fragments of stolen lives. The emotional climax of this phase of the trial arrived when Victoria Gray presented a small, intricately carved wooden bird. She called the elderly father of Michael Taus, a 20-year-old college student who had vanished 7 years earlier and was one of the victims identified from the mass grave to the stand. Tors, a frail man with hands gnarled from a lifetime of carpentry, explained that he had carved the bird for his son as a good luck charm before he left for college. He identified the carving with a certainty that was both heartbreaking and absolute. As the beef carried the wooden bird in its evidence bag towards the witness stand, a gasp was heard from the front row. Michael's mother, seeing the small token of love that she hadn't seen in 7 long years, let out a cry of pure, undiluted anguish. The sound filled the courtroom, a visceral expression of a parent's worst nightmare made real. It was a sound of recognition, of loss, and of the horrifying confirmation that her son's last moments were spent with the monster sitting just feet away. Ethan Carlson watched this display of parental agony with a detached curiosity of a scientist observing an experiment. He tilted his head slightly, a faint analytical smile on his face, as if trying to understand the strange loud noise the woman was making. He felt no empathy, no guilt, only a sense of profound superiority. The bird was his trophy, a symbol of his power and his victory over Michael Tors. Seeing the pain it caused the family was simply an added bonus, a confirmation of the magnitude of his actions. This moment was a powerful mid-trial twist, not because it revealed new information about the crime, but because it so vividly illustrated the defendant's soullessness. The trophy was not just an object. It was a symbol of his need to possess and control, to dehumanize his victims by reducing their existence to a trinket in a box. It showed the jury that these were not crimes of passion or impulse. They were the calculated actions of a collector, a hunter who savored the spoils of his conquests. The discovery and presentation of these trophies became a recurring devastating theme in the prosecution's case. For each victim, there was an item, a personal touchstone that connected them to their families and their lives. And for each item, there was a family member who had to take the stand and identify it, reliving their loss in the most public and painful way imaginable. Each piece of testimony was a dagger to the heart of the families, but it was also a nail in Ethan Carlson's legal coffin. The contrast between the sacredness of these objects to the families and their profane status as trophies for the killer was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. It spoke to the vast, unbridgeable chasm between good and evil, between love and a complete lack thereof. The city of Savannah, with its deep respect for history and heirlooms, was witnessing a man who had perverted that very idea, creating his own dark museum of stolen memories. The evidence presented was not just proof of his guilt. It was a window into the terrifying emptiness of his soul, a place where human lives were valued only as collectibles. The trial was no longer just about what Ethan Carlson did. It was about what he was, and the trophies he kept proved that he was a monster who collected souls. Stephen Wright, Ethan Carlson's defense attorney, was facing a legal battle that was not only unwinnable, but professionally nightmarish. His client was actively hostile to his own defense. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury had already witnessed firsthand the defendant's chilling lack of humanity. Wright's only viable strategy was to attempt to create some form of reasonable doubt, however slim, by arguing that the investigation had been sloppy and that his client was a victim of circumstance. To do this, he needed to present at least a veneer of a credible defense, which meant calling witnesses who could speak to Ethan's character. The defense's case began with a series of character witnesses, former friends and neighbors who, despite the horrific revelations, still clung to a positive image of the man they thought they knew. They spoke of his generosity, his community spirit, his willingness to always lend a hand. Their testimony was hesitant and uncomfortable, a desperate attempt to reconcile the man they had admired with the monster on trial. ABA Victoria Gray dismantled their testimony with surgical precision on cross-examination, forcing them to admit they had no knowledge of what Ethan did behind closed doors. The turning point for the defense and the moment their entire narrative imploded came when Stephen Wright called Andrew Carlson, Ethan's younger brother, to the stand. Andrew was the defense's star character witness, the one person who could theoretically provide a lifetime of context to paint a picture of a troubled but ultimately good man. He was visibly nervous as he took his seat, his resemblance to his brother uncanny, but his eyes held a haunted, fearful look that stood in stark contrast to Ethan's cold confidence. Stephen Wright began his direct examination, his questions designed to elicit stories of brotherly affection and a normal, loving upbringing. He asked Andrew to describe Ethan's role as an older brother, expecting tales of guidance and protection. Andrew's answers were clipped and evasive, his gaze constantly shifting between the floor and his brother at the defense table. Ethan watched him with an intensity that was palpable, a silent command to stick to a prearranged script of lies. Then, Wright asked a seemingly innocuous question. "Can you tell the jury about Ethan's reputation for honesty?" Andrew hesitated, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at his brother, whose encouraging smile had been replaced by a subtle, menacing glare. In that moment, the years of fear and silent complicity seemed to crumble under the weight of the truth. Andrew took a deep, shuddering breath and turned to the jury, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and resolve. "My brother," he began. His voice barely a whisper, "has never been an honest person." A shocked murmur went through the courtroom. Stephen Wright looked as if he had been physically struck, his carefully constructed defense collapsing in real time. He tried to interject to regain control of his witness, but Andrew was no longer listening. The dam of silence had broken. "He was always cruel," Andrew continued, his voice growing stronger. "He used to hurt animals when we were kids. He told me it was our secret." He went on to describe a specific incident from their childhood, a story of shocking cruelty involving a neighbor's dog that Ethan had tortured. It was a secret Andrew had kept for over 30 years, a dark memory that had festered in his conscience. He had been called to the stand to praise his brother's character, but instead he was confessing to his lifelong knowledge of his brother's true nature. The testimony was a catastrophic backfire for the defense. Their key character witness had just provided the prosecution with a textbook example of early psychopathic behavior, a crucial piece of the psychological puzzle. Ethan Carlson sat motionless, his mask of calm finally cracking. A flicker of pure unadulterated rage flashed in his eyes, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the defense table. He had been betrayed by the one person he thought he could still control. Victoria Gay's cross-examination was brief and devastating. She didn't need to attack Andrew. She simply allowed him to continue to unburden himself of the secrets he had carried. He spoke of Ethan's manipulative nature, his charm that was always a means to an end, his complete lack of empathy. It was testimony that no one, least of all the defense, had seen coming. Andrew had been called to save his brother, but instead he had chosen to save himself to finally speak the truth, no matter the cost. The implosion of the defense's case was total and complete. They had presented their witness as a testament to Ethan's good character, and that same witness had revealed him to be a monster in training from childhood. The narrative twist was stunning, a moment of high courtroom drama that sealed Ethan Carlson's fate more effectively than any piece of forensic evidence could have. The jury now saw not just the crimes, but the origin of the man who committed them. The charming city of Savannah had its own deep-seated scandals, but none were as dark as the secrets kept within the Carlson family. Secrets that had just been dragged, kicking, and screaming into the light. With the defense's case in ruins and Ethan Carlson's guilt established beyond any conceivable doubt, the trial moved into its final, most emotionally charged phase, the victim impact statements. This was the point where the focus shifted from the perpetrator to the lives he had destroyed. A chance for the families to address the court and the killer directly. One by one, family members took the stand, their voices thick with grief, to speak of the loved ones they had lost. They shared stories, memories, and photographs, each testimony a poignant and powerful testament to the value of a life stolen. The courtroom became a vessel for collective sorrow. A father spoke of his son, a bright young man with a passion for music, whose guitar now sat silent in his empty bedroom. A sister wept as she described her older sibling, her protector and best friend, who would never walk her down the aisle at her wedding. A husband delivered a gut-wrenching tribute to his wife, his high school sweetheart, speaking of a love story cut brutally short. The jury listened intently, many of them openly weeping, the sterile formality of the trial giving way to raw, unfiltered human pain. Through it all, Ethan Carlson remained a statue of indifference. He listened to the stories of the lives he had shattered with a look of detached boredom, occasionally stifling a yawn or examining his fingernails. He showed no remorse, no flicker of empathy, no sign that the immense suffering in the room was registering on any human level. To him, these heartfelt tributes were nothing more than a tedious delay, an annoying procedural hurdle before the final act of his grand performance. The breaking point, the moment that would forever be seared into the memory of everyone who witnessed it, came when the mother of the youngest victim took the stand. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, and her 8-year-old son, Daniel, had been one of the first victims identified from the mass grave, having disappeared over a decade ago. She was a woman hollowed out by grief, but her eyes held a fire of maternal love that even a decade of sorrow could not extinguish. She did not speak of anger or hatred. Instead, she spoke directly to her son, telling him how much she loved him, how much she missed his goofy smile and his love for superhero comics. She described the agony of not knowing the years of false hope and crushing despair. The courtroom was utterly silent, hanging on her every word. Then, as she concluded her statement, a sound cut through the stillness, a sound so vile and unexpected that it felt like a physical blow. It was the sound of laughter. Ethan Carlson was laughing. It wasn't a small chuckle or a smirk. It was a full, unrestrained laugh, his head thrown back, his body shaking with mirth. He was laughing at a grieving mother at the memory of the 8-year-old boy he had murdered and buried in his garden. The sound was a desecration, a final sadistic act of cruelty that pushed the courtroom past its breaking point. Sarah Jenkins stopped speaking, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. The prosecutor, Victoria Gray, shot to her feet, her fa the gallery erupted in outrage. Family members of the V. Victims surged forward, held back by baifs, their grief momentarily eclipsed by a wave of righteous fury. The sound in the room was a cacophony of shouting, sobbing, and the relentless pounding of the judge's gavel. and at the center of it all sat Ethan Carlson, laughing, his eyes shining with a triumphant demonic light. He was reveling in the chaos he had created, feeding on the pain and anger like a parasite. The judge had no choice but to clear the courtroom. Ethan was dragged away by baifs, still laughing. His final act of defiance, a sound that would haunt the halls of that courthouse forever. The breaking point had been reached and shattered. There was no more pretense, no more legal maneuvering, only the raw, undeniable reality of a man who was not just a killer, but a creature who found joy in human suffering. The city of Savannah had seen its share of scandals, but it had never witnessed a moment of such pure theatrical evil. The trial was effectively over. All that remained was the formal pronouncement of a fate that Ethan Carlson had sealed with a single horrifying laugh. After the chaos of Ethan Carlson's laughter-fueled outburst, the trial resumed in a state of tense, somber anticipation. The prosecution had one final witness to call, a move that Ada Victoria Gray had held in reserve for the rebuttal phase of the trial. It was a witness whose testimony she hoped would provide the final definitive insight into the killer's soul. She called Andrew Carlson back to the stand. This time, he was not a witness for the defense, but for the prosecution, and he had been granted immunity in exchange for his full and truthful testimony. Andrew took the stand looking like a different man. The fear that had defined his previous appearance was gone, replaced by a grim, weary resolve. He had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. He looked not at his brother, but directly at the jury, as if pleading for them to understand the burden he had carried for his entire life. Ethan watched him from the defense table, his jovial mask gone, replaced by a look of cold reptilian fury. He had been betrayed, and his anger was radiating across the courtroom. Victoria Gray began her questioning softly, taking Andrew back to the day of Ella Powell's disappearance. She asked him where he was, what he was doing, and then the main twist, the final horrifying revelation of the trial, began to unfold. Andrew confessed that he had been at Ethan's house that night. He had gone there for dinner, a regular weekly occurrence, and he had been there when Ethan returned home, his clothes disheveled and his eyes alight with a familiar, terrifying excitement. Under Gray's careful questioning, Andrew described a conversation that chilled the courtroom to its core. Ethan had confessed everything to him that night, not in a moment of guilt or panic, but with a braggadocious pride. He described how he had found Ella Powell, how he had faked the roadside emergency, how he had savored her fear. He recounted the details of her murder with a calm, analytical precision that Andrew found paralyzing. He had confessed to his younger brother as if sharing a story about a successful day at work. This was the first part of the bombshell. The second was even more devastating. Andrew admitted that this was not the first time Ethan had confessed to him. For years, Ethan had used him as a secret confessor, a silent repository for his monstrous deeds. After each murder, he would tell Andrew the details, forcing him to be a party to the horror, binding him with a mixture of fear and twisted brotherly loyalty. Andrew had become his unwilling accomplice after the fact, a keeper of secrets that were slowly destroying him from the inside. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Andrew recounted years of these one-sided confessions. He explained that Ethan needed an audience, a witness to his supposed genius. He had chosen his own brother for this role, trapping him in a web of psychological terror. If Andrew ever threatened to go to the police, Ethan would calmly remind him that he knew where Andrew's wife and children lived. A subtle but unmistakable threat that had kept him silent for over a decade. The final revelation was the answer to the question that had hung over the entire trial. Why did Ethan Carlson do these things? Andrew explained that his brother believed he was a superior being unbound by the moral codes of lesser humans. But the true motive, the one Ethan had confessed in a rare moment of drunken candor, was even more pathetic and twisted. He killed because it was the only way he could feel anything at all. He was an empty vessel, a man devoid of real emotion. And the only thing that could fill the void was the power of life and death, the thrill of the hunt, and the subsequent admiration of his own dark secret reflected in his brother's horrified eyes. This testimony was the ultimate betrayal in Ethan's mind, but it was the ultimate act of liberation for Andrew. He was finally unburdening himself of a lifetime of complicity and fear. He was not just testifying against a murderer. He was testifying against the man who had systematically destroyed his life, who had made him a psychological prisoner. His confession explained everything. Ethan's arrogance, his lack of remorse, his need for an audience, he was not just a killer, he was a performer. And Andrew had been his sole captive audience member for years. When the testimony concluded, the courtroom was silent. There were no more questions to be asked, no more evidence needed. The jury had heard the final horrifying truth from the one person who knew the killer best. The charming southern city of Savannah, a place of deep family ties and unspoken loyalties, had just witnessed the most profound breaking of those bonds imaginable. A brother had testified against a brother, not just to condemn him, but to expose the very nature of his evil, an evil that required not just a victim, but a witness. And in that courtroom, everyone had finally become a witness. The jury's deliberation was a formality, a brief interlude before the inevitable conclusion. They returned in less than an hour, their faces grim and resolved. The court clerk read the verdict, guilty on all counts, for the murder of Ella Powell and the 6 other victims unearthed from his yard. The word guilty, repeated 7 times, echoed in the silent courtroom. Each pronouncement a small measure of justice for a life brutally stolen. The families of the victims wept, not with joy, but with the exhausted relief that comes at the end of a long and agonizing journey. Ethan Carlson received the verdict without any visible reaction. He simply stared straight ahead, a placid, almost bored expression on his face. The arrogance, the laughter, the rage, all of it had been replaced by an unsettling emptiness. He had played his final card, performed his final act, and now he was simply waiting for the curtain to fall. The sentencing was scheduled for the following day, but the outcome was already a certainty. On the day of sentencing, Judge Eleanor Ross entered the courtroom with an air of profound gravity. She looked at Ethan Carlson, not with a dispassionate eye of the law, but with a look of deep personal disgust. When the time came for the defendant to offer a final statement, Ethan, against the frantic advice of his lawyer, rose to his feet. The room held its breath, bracing for one last outburst, one final insult. Instead, he simply smiled at the families of his victims, a slow, deliberate, and terrifying smirk, and then sat back down without saying a word. It was then that Judge Ross delivered her sentence, and with it a speech that would be quoted in newspapers for years to come. She abandoned the usual judicial restraint, her voice thick with a controlled fury that was more powerful than any shout. She spoke not of legal statutes or precedents, but of the nature of evil itself. She described Ethan Carlson as a black hole in the shape of a man, a void of humanity, who had fed on the light and goodness of others. "You are a cancer on the soul of this community," she said, her eyes locked on his. "You took advantage of the very best of human nature, kindness, trust, compassion, and you used it as a weapon. You have shown this court, this community, and the families you have destroyed that you possess not a single shred of remorse, empathy, or decency. You are a predator who found joy in suffering. And for that, you deserve nothing less than to be removed from the human race for the remainder of your life." She sentenced him to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 100 years, ensuring that he would die in prison. With each life sentence she read, she stated the name of the victim, giving them the final word. For the life of Ella Powell, for the life of Michael Torres, for the life of Daniel Jenkins, it was a powerful, solemn litany, a reclamation of their identities from the man who had tried to reduce them to trophies. As the sentence was read, Ethan Carlson's placid facade remained intact. He showed no emotion, no disappointment, no fear. He had been rendered powerless, his ability to inflict pain and chaos finally stripped away by the unyielding machinery of the law. As the bailiffs came to lead him from the courtroom for the last time, he did something that would be the final chilling image of the trial. He turned slowly and looked directly at the front row where the families of his victims sat huddled together. His polite, neighborly smile returned, the one he had used to lure so many to their doom. And then, as he was led through the door and out of their lives forever, he gave one last terrifying smirk. It was a final silent message of contempt, a promise that even locked away the memory of his evil would remain. The monster was caged, but the smirk would haunt their nightmares, a final testament to a man who was evil to his very core. The trial was over, and the city of Savannah, forever scarred by the scandal, could finally begin the long, slow process of healing.